So we are going to have a look at a story that will be very familiar to you this morning. I have no doubt. Oops, sorry. I'm having a slight problem because I've got a thing at the bottom that means I can't actually see. Just see if I can move that. Never mind, that'll be fine. Okay, we're going to start with Samuel, very famous story that you will be aware of, where Samuel hears the voice of God. So I'm going to see if I can actually read it, even though I have something across the bottom of my screen. Oh, hang on, I've figured it out. There we go, all is sorted. So you can follow this with me as I read it to you now. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I didn't call you, go back and lie down." So he went and he lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I didn't call you, go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The third time the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." A very famous story, one that you will be incredibly familiar with, I have no doubt. But I just offer you some reflections on that this morning, which may or may not be useful to you, but different things speak to different people at different times. So as I'm sure you are aware, Samuel was the child of Hannah, and Hannah, his mother, had promised Samuel to the tabernacle that she was going to hand him over when he was born, which she did. And so Samuel had been in the temple for quite a number of years by that point, serving under Eli. And what's interesting is that when Samuel hears this voice, he immediately runs to Eli because he thinks it's Eli's voice. Now, Samuel would have been very familiar with Eli's voice because he'd been living and working with Eli for a number of years. And for me, that always makes me think, well, what does the voice of God actually sound like? And I think sometimes we have this view that it's going to be some big booming voice from the sky that we're not going to recognize. But actually, does God just speak to us in really ordinary ways, in ways that are just so normal and so familiar that perhaps we don't always notice that it is God? I think it's also interesting that Eli is an older mentor to Samuel. And it was him who eventually recognized that it was God that was speaking. And I guess we could ask ourselves the question, well, what does that teach us about speaking with other Christians to try and work things out? Is that part of what we are supposed to do as Christians, is to talk about it and say, what do you think this means, to those people who perhaps have got more experience of listening to God? It also makes me wonder about our role as people who work with children and young people. How do we help the young people that we work with to recognize God's voice? Just like Eli did eventually, who said, "Oh, it's God who's speaking to you, go back and listen." Are we encouraging our children and young people to listen to God? And are we expecting God to speak to our children and young people? And I think there's something really interesting about that. Samuel wasn't expecting God to speak, otherwise he would have recognized it. And I'm not sure that Eli was expecting God to speak to Samuel. It took him quite a while to figure that out. But eventually he does recognize that. And do we, as people who work with children and young people, do we expect God to speak to our children and young people? Are we at times possibly a bit dismissive of that idea? If a young person said, "Oh, I think God was saying this to me," do we go, "Really? Oh, they're there, okay." Or do we say, "Brilliant, God will be speaking to you"? Do we expect God to speak to our children and young people? And then also to think about, what was Samuel doing when God spoke to him? And I find this really interesting that he actually spoke to him when he was asleep. So he was lying down somewhere, he was sleeping. He wasn't expecting to hear God at that point, But what is interesting is that he had stopped from the busyness of his day, the noise, the busyness, the hustle, the bustle had stopped because he was lying down and he was sleeping. And that was the point at which God spoke to him. And I don't know whether that means we should be putting an intentional time aside, or whether it's sometimes we don't hear God's voice because our lives are so busy and because there are things going on. But I just wonder whether that is something to reflect upon. And finally, and I take heart from this, is that neither Samuel nor Eli gets it right. They both kind of go, oh, I think it's you, Eli. No, it's not me. Go away. Oh, I think it's you, Eli. No, it's not me. Go away. They're both getting it wrong. And then eventually they figure it out. And in the midst of all that, God doesn't give up. God doesn't go, oh, they're not listening. I'm going to try somebody else. He keeps saying and he keeps talking until eventually they recognize him. We all make mistakes. We don't always recognize God when we hear his voice, but he doesn't give up on us. And we will get there eventually because God will keep talking to us. So I take quite a lot of heart from that. I'm going to just suggest that we spend just a couple of minutes in silence now, where we can stop from the busyness, stop from our thoughts, stop from people talking, and just spend a bit of time listening to God, perhaps, or just reflecting on that passage and what might have struck you from that. So having 2 minutes of quiet just to remember and to recognize that we are in God's presence, and just to take a moment to reflect. So I am going to mute myself. You can all mute yourself, and we'll just have 2 minutes. If you want to look away from the screen, if you want to turn your camera off at this point, that's absolutely fine. And we'll just be quiet for a moment, and then I'll bring us back and we can for a prayer.